because tonight is going to get rather complicated as we talk about Subbotniks Karaites and Subbotnik Karaites. And if we get time, we'll talk about Crimean Karaites as well. Okay. Subbotniks. So we won't talk about Subbotniks, we'll talk about Karaites. So who are the Karaites? So the Karaites, they believe only in the written law. So they believe that the Torah was given by God to Moses at Mount Sinai, and but they do not believe that there was a Torah Ba'al Peh, and they do not believe in any of the rabbinic discussions that came afterwards. So they do not believe in sanctity of the Mishnah and the Gemara, for example. Where are they located? So there is a population of 1,000 Karaites in the USA, I think mainly in California. Most of the Karaites are in Israel, so there are about 40,000 in Israel. Biggest community is in Ashdod. There's also a significant number in Ramla, and there are also Karaites in the Ukraine, and there are about 500 left in Crimea that we'll talk about later on. So who are the Karaites? Well, who are they not? So in one of the first talks, I talked about the Shomranim, or the Samaritans, who live on Har Gerizim and also in Holon. They also only believe in the written law. But and who were the Shomranim? We said that they came at the time of the exile of the 10 tribes of Israel, and they were either part of those 10 tribes, or more likely they were brought by the Assyrians from Ethiopia. So, and the Karaites are not the Shomranim. Josephus talks about Sadducees. Sadducees also only believe in the written Torah. Excuse me. So at the time of the Second Temple, there were Pharisees who were the Pharisees means they split themselves off from mainstream Judaism. They are the rabbis. We come from Pharisees. The Sadducees were mainly the Kohanim, and they began only to believe in the written law, but the Karaites are not the Sadducees. So who are they? Well, they're a much newer split. So seemingly they're a split in the late 8th century. And they were people that followed Anan ben David, and they became known as Ananites. And in 770, Anan ben David, he wrote his Sefer Mitzvot that was based only on the Torah. And there was a golden age that followed in the 10th, 11th, and 12th century, a golden age where many books, many Sifrei HaKodesh, were written by Karaite rabbis. And the followers of Anan ben David, they migrated to Palestine and they built a synagogue in Yerushalayim. And you can still see a Karaite synagogue just off the Chorva Square. I don't know whether it's the one that they actually built there. Certainly not the same building. I don't know if it's the same place, but there is still a Karaite synagogue in Yerushalayim. And the sect would also diffuse and would go to Syria, Egypt, and also to Southeast Europe. The gentleman you see here is the chief rabbi of the Karaites. It's not Anan ben David from the 8th century. So how does a Karaite synagogue look? Well, in Karaite synagogues, no one fights over chairs because there aren't any. There is a carpet, and Karaites will prostrate themselves on the carpet very much the same way that Muslims worship. Their prayers are based on biblical passages, and their interpretation of laws is based on pshat. So it's based on what is written in the Torah with traditions that they have. So one of the most well-known differences between Karaite Judaism and mainstream Judaism is, for example, Shabbat. So they believe where it says the prohibition against biur, okay, is not that you cannot light a candle or you cannot turn your cooker on. They believe it's that you cannot make any kind of fire. So there's no cooking at all for the Karaites on Shabbat, and they eat cold food. And as far as lights go, they also they're not prepared to use the electricity provided by the Israeli electricity company, because somewhere along the line, someone in the electricity company is contravening those regulations on making fire. So they have they generally have a battery-driven LED or fluorescent lights, but they don't use on Shabbat, they don't use the electricity of the electricity company. Another good example, and very relevant to the period that we're in now, is Shavuot and counting of the Omer. So in Shmot it says Mimacharat Shabbat, and we understand Shabbat in that context, Shabbat being Pesach, to count after the first day of Pesach. So we will have Shavuot on Friday. The Karaites won't, because they understand it literally. They understand Mimacharat Shabbat as from the night after, from the day after Shabbat. So they always start counting on Motzei Shabbat, and Shavuot in their calendar is always on a Sunday. The same goes for Tefillin. So we know about Tefillin from the Shema. So for example, Totzafot, and the rabbis interpreted what is Rashi or Rabbeinu Tam interpreted what is the meaning of tefillin, but the Karaites don't have tefillin. They say that what the Shema is talking about is you need to make a link between man and God from your head and from your heart, from your lev, but there's no tefillin involved. And in terms of mezuzot, also the same reason, they don't have mezuzot. They do on the synagogues, they have some kind of basically, this resembles a mezuzah, but it's not a mezuzah. There's no parchment, and they have inscribed on the outside the 10 Commandments, but it's not the mezuzot that we have. For tzitzit, they have a tchelet, they have the blue, but they don't have the rabbinical tradition that we have, that the dye has to be from a mollusk, from the argamon. They don't have that at all. They can use any blue dye to make the tchelet of the tzitzit. So, critical question: are these Karaites Jews? So, if we ask the Rambam, the Rambam says that those people that deny the Torah Shabbat, the oral law, are heretics. But he lived a couple of hundred years after Karaites, so he knew about Karaites. He basically said that they're not really to be held accountable for their actions, because it's not the Karaites' fault, it's his father's fault, and it was his grandfather's fault. In 1971, Avadia Yosef proclaimed Karaites as Jews and allowed marriage between Jews and Karaites. And in 2007, Rav David Shlush, who was the chief rabbi of Netanya, he said, we accept them as Jews, and every one of them that wants to come back, we accept. So Karaites are largely regarded as Jewish, particularly by Sephardic rabbis. So Rav Avadia Yosef, Bakshi Daron, who was the chief rabbi after Avadia Yosef, encouraged Karaites to marry Jews, and even to this day, Karaites can, particularly if the Sephardic rabbi is doing the ceremony, Karaite Jews can marry traditional Jews without any kind of conversion. And let's move on, let's do a complete reset. Now Subbotniks. And who are Subbotniks? So Karaites is a religion. Subbotniks is not a religion, it's a race. They are 19th century Russians, Christians, who Christians believe in the Old Testament, and they became very, very close to the Old Testament, such that these Subbotniks or Sabbatarians started to observe the Lord's Day of Rest, not on Sunday as the rest of the Christian world did, but rather on Saturday. And slowly, slowly, this led to them circumcising their children, stopping believing in Jesus, and stopping eating pork. So they became very close to being, at least on the outside, they became very close to what we know as Jews. And in fact, in the 1820s, these Subbotniks started developing contacts with Jews of the Pale of the Settlement. Of course, the Russian authorities didn't like that at all. The Tsar was known for his persecution of the Jews, and the Tsar decided to exile all the Subbotniks to the Caucasus and Siberia, Caucasus being Georgia, Azerbaijan, Armenia, and families had children ripped from them, and these children were given to Christian families for adoption. And some Subbotniks were also forced to convert to Christianity. Nonetheless, a significant number of Subbotniks actually became practicing Jews. And several of them actually managed to get out of Russia and make Aliyah. An example is the Dubrovin family that in 1904 settled in Yesod HaMa'ala near the Chula Valley Lake and established a farm. And conditions, as we know, there were terrible. 2 sons and 2, I'm not sure it's, I think, is it grandfathers? I think it may be grandchildren, died of malaria. But the farm was held still by the Dubrovin family through the generations. Yoav Dubrovin, the father, gave it to his son Yitzhak. And when Yitzhak retired from the farm, he gave it to the JNF. Here you see the Dubrovin family at the top here. And at the bottom, you can see what the Dubrovin farm looks like now. The JNF have developed it as a heritage center. And you can actually see there how farming was done in the early 20th century. There was, the gentleman you see on the right-hand side is Alexander Zaid. He's famous. He was a Subbotnik. And in the 20s and 30s, he was an active member of the Shomer. The Shomer is the organization that defended Jewish settlements and came before the Haganah. And in 1938, Alexander Zaid was out on his horse with his gun, doing his job, when he was attacked by Bedouins and murdered. And I think in 1942, the blood was settled and the murderer of Alexander Zaid himself was assassinated. There were later aliyot of Subbotniks. So in the 1970s, Subbotniks made Aliyah. Then in the period of the 80s, Russia basically closed its door. But after Glasnost and the fall of the Iron Curtain in the 1990s, other Subbotniks made Aliyah and came with the big Russian Aliyah and came to live in Israel. So we talked about are the Karaites Jews, and we said they are the Subbotniks Jews. Okay, so the Subbotniks of the early Aliyah, they converted. Why were they called Subbotniks? So Subbotniks, so we said why they were called Subbotniks, but they were also known as Jeri, Talmudisti, suggesting that they learned Talmud, and they were also known as Shaposhniki. Shaposhniki, I'm so good on Russian pronunciation. That came from the Russian for hat, because these Subbotniks went around wearing fur hats exactly like Ashkenazic Jews. And that's exactly what they were. They although in blood they weren't maybe Ashkenazic Jews, they looked and they observed Judaism like these Ashkenazic Jews. Of course, when they came on Aliyah, they had no documentation to prove that they converted, and nobody asked them for it. It was simply accepted by their way of life that they were religious Jews. And of course, they were detested by the traditional Jezreel Valley, Galilee settlers of the second Aliyah, who were the complete opposite. They were the anti-religious, okay? And they really hated the Subbotniks because of their religious because that they were observed the laws of Judaism. In 2004, so I said that the Subbotniks came in the 70s and the 90s. In 2004, Rav Amma decided that Subbotniks were not Jewish enough to qualify under the law of return of Jews. There was a lot of political pressure, religious pressure on Sephardic rabbis by Ashkenazim, and he decided to put a stop to Subbotniks making Aliyah, which left between 10 to 15,000 Subbotniks in Russia, wanting actually a large number of them to make Aliyah, if not for religious reasons, but for the ultimate reason that their economic situation would definitely be better in Israel than it was in Russia. Okay, so we talked about Karaites, talked about Subbotniks. Well, who were the Subbotnik Karaites? So I mentioned that the Subbotniks converted to Orthodox Judaism, but at the same time there were Subbotniks that didn't do that. There were Subbotniks that, the same way, they were Christians originally. They became close to the Bible. They kept the Sabbath. They were close to the written law. So they reached out to the Karaite community that was in Mother Russia, and they were converted by the Karaites. So they became Subbotnik Karaites. And there are still small communities of them, and there are around Volgograd, which I think was Stalingrad, there are still communities of, to this day, there are communities of Subbotnik Karaites that at the moment are stuck there and can't come to Israel. And finally, I'll talk a little bit about Crimean Karaites. So we talked about Karaites, Subbotnik Karaites, now Crimean Karaites. Remember I said most of the Karaites today, 40,000 live in Israel, about 1,000 in America, 1,100 in the Ukraine, and about 500 of those 1,000 are in the Crimea. So who are they? Well, two possibilities. They're descendants of, they're descendants of Karaite Jews, or they are the Khazar myth. And the Khazar myth is that the whole of Ashkenazic Judaism are not actually Jews that descended from Jews that were originally in Israel that moved to Babylon. No, the Khazar myth is that all these Ashkenazic Jews were originally Khazars, which are basically some kind of Turks. And Crimean Karaites said, a lot of them said, we're not actually Jewish, we are Khazars. And they were, they thought their life would be much better if they could prove that they were Khazars. In 1863, they appealed to the Tsar and they said, no, we're not Jews, we're not going to go, please don't send us off to the Pale of the Settlement. Give us the same status as other minorities like Christians and Tatars. And amazingly, the Tsar decided that was okay and he would do that. And the issue of whether they were Jews or not Jews, of course, became very relevant in the 1930s with the rise of the Nazis. And the Nazis actually looked at the status of the Karaites. There were actually Karaites living in Germany. And the Nazis, as we know, were very thorough on who was Jewish, who wasn't Jewish. And the Families Office decided that the Karaite sect should not be considered a Jewish religious community within the meaning of whatever regulations they have of the Reich citizenship law. Okay, it cannot be established that the Karaites in their entirety are blood-related stock for racial categorization of an individual, etc., etc., etc. So the Reich decided they were not Jewish. In 1944, an SS Obergruppenführer Berger, he was in the Crimea, and he wrote about the Karaites. Their Mosaic religion is unwelcome. However, on grounds of race, language, and religious dogma, discrimination against the Karaites is unacceptable. And he suggested that the Karaites that were there in the Crimea, they should be formed into a small group, and they should be formed into a construction or a labor battalion. I'm sure the Germans, the SS, certainly would have been very happy to murder them. And if the Germans weren't happy to murder them, the Ukrainians for sure would have been. By the way, some Karaites in the Crimea were murdered. In Vilnius and Trakai, the Nazis forced the Karaite leader, Saraya Shapsel. By the way, Shapsel had made the Karaites even less Jewish in the 1930s. Here you actually see his synagogue, and they removed the Magen David from the synagogue in an attempt to show the outside world that they weren't Jewish. He was forced by the Nazis to make a list of his community. Not every Karaite was saved. At the end of the war, the Soviets would count 6,357 Karaites left in the Crimea. In the 1990s, 500 Crimean Karaites made Aliyah to Israel. And as I mentioned, the community has dwindled to about 500 now. But interestingly enough, recently, there were studies done looking at the DNA, at both the nuclear and the mitochondrial chromosomal material of Crimean Karaites, and it was shown that their DNA was closely related to Middle Eastern Jews and not related at all to Khazars, which basically showed that after all this story, the Crimean Karaites seemingly, blood-wise, are Jews. And luckily, the Nazis didn't have, were not able to do DNA analysis.